Hello, everyone, and welcome to lecture number 2 for the class. This topic has to do with England's entry into the colonial race. England and the Dutch, the Netherlands, actually both entered roughly around the same time when it came to exploring abroad. But the English are going to have a little bit more freedom for a certain extent, because when we look at this map that I showed you at the end of the last lecture, you'll notice that this is all the Spanish colonial dominions right here, right? This is all this red area where the Spanish between roughly 1492 with Columbus's discoveries perhaps, all the way through about 1550, Spain ends up conquering a whole bunch of territory from the New World, as they called it, to parts of Europe, even places in Europe where the Spanish, for a variety of reasons, felt like they have a destiny to conquer. Typically, the reason why the Spanish went conquering in Europe had to do with reformations. We're going to talk about this in a minute, but in parts of Europe, as we get into the 1500s, especially the early 1500s, you will see the birth of the very first anti Catholic Christian Reformation movements. The Lutherans, the Calvinists, which today you might know as the Presbyterians, and a few other offshoots and more, are going to start to pop up right here in the middle of Europe. And Spain, becoming the most powerful Catholic nation in the world, is going to take it upon itself to become the sword arm of the Catholic Church. And they're going to send armies with all this money that they're getting from all this trade and all this conquest. They're going to send armies of conquistadors into any territory in Europe that tries to rebel against Catholic religious authority. And the Dutch are going to do this as well as some of the German peoples. And so you're going to see the Spanish actually occupying regions in Central Europe where you've got Lutherans and Calvinists and that sort of thing popping up. Well, the English are going to be doing the same thing. You're going to see a Reformation movement there, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But it takes the Spanish a lot longer to get to England to try to end England's Reformation than it does for the Spanish to get into the Netherlands and parts of Germany. And that has a lot to do with the fact that England already had a navy that was good for defense, so the Spanish weren't really keen on going straight there to attack it. And the Spanish had already conquered the Netherlands before the Netherlands really got busy with lots of colonies, and so the Netherlands do set up some colonies here. The biggest one, known as New York, right, which the Dutch actually called it New Amsterdam, but it'll end up becoming New York when the English conquer that too. And so the English have some more time that they can kind of expand and send explorers in and try the colonial game. And that's really what this whole thing is about here. So we talked about the Portuguese, and they're going around Africa to reestablish this Silk Road connection by sea. Then the Spanish are going to try it with Columbus sailing west and ends up hitting here instead. And that results in the Spanish just conquering everything in their path because that's what the Spanish were. What about the English? Well, the English are kind of interesting because when we look at these guys, we can look at a number of different people that are part of England's slow modernization to the point where it's going to need to start to go and set up maritime colonies as well. And those will lead directly to what will one day become the United States. So we're finally there because of the Portuguese and then the Spanish. We then have the English moving abroad, right? And then you have these American colonies that are English based colonies. You'll notice over here on the right, this is Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, this is her kind of her victory painting. This is a propaganda piece, really, that was all over England when it came to her reign because it actually shows not only her authority. You know, she's got the crown jewels on, and her hereditary crown is back here, and her hand is placed over this globe to show the part of the world that England has influence over. And then behind her, I think even more important, there's a navy. Probably hard to see, but there's a navy here with a bunch of sails that have red crosses on them. And then there's a destroyed navy over here, and meaning there's bad weather, some kind of storm, and there's a sinking navy. Well, what happens here, guys, is that Queen Elizabeth is this young queen who is in charge of England at a time when there was a lot of strife. And part of that strife was that the Spanish are going to send finally a crusading conquistador fleet conquistador, fleet to attack England because England under Elizabeth had maintained its Protestant demeanor. And because of this, the Spanish are like, well, the Dutch tried to become Protestant. We're going to stop that. And some of the Germans tried to become Protestant, and we stopped that. Well, finally, it's time for us to go after the English. And we're going to talk about why that matters and how that even happens. And that's what's going to ultimately drive England into needing to expand out to get into colonial settlements. So, and we'll talk about him in a minute, all right? So, what's the background? What leads to all this, all right? To the English colonial efforts. Martin Luther, he's this German religious person. Okay, he is a priest, a Catholic priest in Germany. He is going to be really angry because there have been people that he believes have been corrupt. Catholic priests have been going through Germany, and this is true of all of Europe, they're all over the place. These Catholic priests have been going through Germany in his case, and they've been selling tickets to heaven. And those tickets to heaven, they're called indulgences. These people, these Catholic priests, have been selling tickets to heaven because those tickets, which of course are kind of ludicrous, this idea that you could buy a ticket to paradise, those tickets are being used to pay for the modernization of Rome, meaning they're building a new basilica there, a new cathedral, and that cathedral is going to bring the Catholic Church into the modern Renaissance era. And so it's very expensive. And so the Catholic Church is selling tickets to heaven called indulgences. Martin Luther is really angry about this. He is a dyed, true in the wool Catholic monk who would not consider corruption to be something he would ever do. And he cannot believe that the Catholic Church is telling people to buy tickets to heaven. He can't believe it. He's so mad about that and a few other things that he writes out 95 essays, little essays, as to why the Catholic Church needs to be reformed, why it's corrupt, and why it needs to be reformed. And he's going to march these little essays called the 95 Theses, right? 95 statements as to what the Catholic Church needs to do to return to the proper faith. And he writes these in German, meaning the German people can actually read these if they know how to read, like the middle class. And he's going to nail these things on a church door in the university town that he lives in. And what's going to happen is it's 1517. That's the year when this happens. Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. In 1517, there had already been people by this time who had said the Catholic Church was corrupt. It's just that their voices never went very far, and they were tried for heresy, and these reformists would be usually burned at the stake or some other kind of execution, therefore maintaining the church's power. Well, Martin Luther comes along at a very interesting time. He comes along, says the Catholic Church is corrupt. A lot of German people actually agree with him. And on top of that, there happens to be this invention that's around at the time called the printing press. The printing press is going to spread the 95 Theses all over Europe. And people are going to learn about why this well known, at this time, Catholic priest believes that the Catholic Church is corrupt and wrong. And so there's this huge movement amongst people who really did want to see a reformation, who suddenly can read from the inside what's going on that needs to be fixed. And so Martin Luther is really going to have a lot of power in weakening the Catholic Church. And that's because there was also a printing press that Luther did not originally intend to use. He was just mad. He basically fired off in 1517, him putting these theses on a church door with nails. It's kind of like somebody firing off an angry tweet and walking away, and then waking up in the morning and finding out that it's been shared 5 billion times. It's one of those things, going, whoops, oh my gosh, everybody's seen it. So it's this printing press, and that Gutenberg printing press is going to spread this Reformation around Europe. So in 1530 to 35, there's this king named Henry VIII. He's the King of England. And this is a whole separate issue, but it's going to come together pretty soon. This King of England, Henry VIII, really, really, really wants to divorce his wife. And he wants to divorce his wife because he basically feels that his wife is in breach of contract. What I mean is that these guys did not marry for love at the time. When you're royalty, you marry for property and for alliances of your kingdoms, and you marry for the hereditary line, meaning you need to have children. And Henry VIII's wife, who is a princess of the most powerful empire on earth, the Spanish, all right, a princess from Spain. She doesn't even speak English, all right. Henry VIII and she don't even talk much, except through interpreters. And so Henry VIII is married to her as a business contract, and he is angry because she, Catherine of Aragon of the Empire of Spain, is not bearing him a son. She's borne him a daughter, but not a son. And on top of that, Henry VIII is infatuated. He is in love with an English noblewoman named Anne Boleyn. And so Henry is going to risk something. He's one of those people who have a lot of yes men around him, and he believes that everything he does is right. And he's not all that intelligent when it comes to affairs of state, so he doesn't really quite see why this is going to be a problem. He just sees his own interest as being the interest of everybody in his country. Okay, so he's one of those people. We've had leaders here, I think, in America like this before in the past. So Henry VIII, King of England, and he wants to divorce the Princess of Spain, and that would insult the Spanish Empire. Here's the thing: the Spanish Empire is also in charge of the church. Here they are. The Spanish have sort of conquered, they've annexed really control of Italy. And so the Catholic Church and the Empire of Spain are not going to look very favorably upon England actually saying, we want to divorce your princess because she's not giving us a son, or for any other reason. Okay. And so Henry VIII is told that he is not allowed by the church to divorce his wife. He throws a temper tantrum, and he's trying to figure out, Henry VIII, how can he, in the eyes of his people, legitimately divorce his Spanish wife so that he can marry his English noblewoman that he has fallen in love with, and she has promised him a son. And Henry VIII is thinking about Martin Luther over yonder in Germany, who has managed to start a reformation over in Central Europe. Meaning, it's 1530. You're nearly uh, 10, 12 years into the Reformation that's already spreading like wildfire throughout Europe. And Henry VIII is looking for an excuse to divorce his wife, who is a Catholic Spanish princess. So, what does Henry VIII do? Okay, this is actually kind of brilliant in its own way. All right. The church tells Henry no, so Henry, throwing a temper tantrum, is going to literally invent a brand new church. And he's doing it by saying the Catholic Church is corrupt. Martin Luther says so, and the Catholic Church is no longer worthy of our attention. Martin Luther said so, and also on top of that, I think that I need to divorce my wife because she's not bearing me a son. Breach of contract. Therefore, Henry VIII is going to use the Reformation already in process as an excuse to invent his own church. And so the Church of England is going to come into being, or we would call it today the Anglican Church. In America, it would be known as the Episcopalian Church. Well, the Church of England is in defiance, of course. It is created in defiance of the Catholic Church. It is an entire country going Protestant. Not just Martin Luther, one guy in Germany with the support of a few people. This is an entire country, the island nation of England, going Protestant, okay? And that's how this begins. Henry VIII wants to get married to Anne Boleyn, who he loves, an English woman, and he doesn't love at all the Princess of Spain, Catherine of Aragon, wants to divorce her. She's not giving him a son anyway. He needs to have a son if he's going to carry on the Tudor line of English kings, the dynasty. And that's what happens, okay? And so he's going to marry Anne Boleyn. Ironically, after Henry VIII makes his church, there's going to be some revolts in England. You know, good Catholics who don't want to become heretics, and Henry VIII is going to kick out the Catholics of England, and he's going to also fight against those English people that don't want the Church of England to replace the Catholic Church. And Henry VIII happens to win. He wasn't that bad at war. And so Henry VIII wins against any people in his nation that fight against him, and he institutes the Church of England over everybody in England. We'll talk about what that means on a larger sense in a minute, but here's what happens locally. He marries the noble girl, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn bears him a couple of daughters, but no son. He is going, uh, Henry VIII is going to become increasingly angry with Anne Boleyn, partially because she's getting older and he's getting bored with her, and also she is bearing him only daughters, and so he has her murdered. He has her killed, executed, okay? And then he's going to marry other women too, four other women, some of which he executes and some of which die naturally. Either way, only one ever bears him a son, and his son will die very young. So the deal is that Henry VIII is the last male king of the Tudor dynasty in England. Well, here's the deal. Henry VIII, regardless of his internal problems with trying to have a son, has managed to join the Reformation mostly for his own reasons. And Henry VIII has created his new church and kicked out the Catholics, and now he can divorce whenever he feels like he needs to divorce. And the Pope over in Rome, a Spanish allied Pope, of course, is going to excommunicate Henry VIII. I don't know if you know what that means, but excommunication, when you live in Catholic Europe, and all nations that are legitimate nations are Catholic. If the Pope excommunicates you as a leader, it means that your people no longer have to obey you. In fact, they're not supposed to obey their king if the king is excommunicated. That's sort of a religious way that popes have maintained control over kings all the way since roughly 814 AD. And so the Pope in the 1530s is going to kick Henry VIII out of the Catholic Church and encourage the people of England to rebel. At the same time, Spain is going to impose economic sanctions. If you're an American, you know all about these, okay, because that's something we do all the time. Whenever we don't want to go to war with somebody because war is expensive, we simply tell all of our buddies in the UN to not trade with that nation. And sometimes it works. Most of the time, it doesn't work, and there's reasons for that, but economic sanctions. So Spain declares economic sanctions against England. What this means, folks, is that all of Europe, because of this, because of Henry VIII wanting to become a Protestant so that he can marry whoever he wants, Henry VIII, right here in England, all of Catholic Europe is now told that they cannot trade with England. English ships, wherever they go, cannot be allowed into seaports, or the Spanish will get very mad at them. And so Europe is basically treating England like a pariah and is not allowing itself to trade with this heretic nation of England, as the Spanish would call them. And so England is going to be very soon in deep financial trouble. Hopefully, this is going to start to make sense to you pretty soon. So there's a reformation that happens here. Henry VIII is mad because he's married to a woman that he doesn't love and she's not giving him a son. So Henry VIII joins the Reformation, okay, right here of Central Europe, the Calvinists and the Lutherans, so that he can create his own church and therefore be able to divorce and marry whoever he wants. And now we have a Protestant country called England. The Church of England is in control there. And all of Europe now is no longer in the 1530s on allowed to trade with England. You guys, you might notice something. England's on an island. Okay, it's an island, which means that if you want to make things, if you want an industrial nation, if you want to be able to produce stuff, guess what you have to do? You have to import raw goods from your buddies to actually make things. And if you want to have an economy, you have to export your products to Europe for them to buy your stuff, okay? And so England is basically being told that they're going to be like Cuba in the modern day, where there's going to be sanctions against them and no one's allowed to trade with them and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what does England do? How do they handle the fact that they're under sanctions? So on and so forth. All right. Well, Edward, once Henry VIII finally dies, all right, in a country that's become very poor because of those sanctions that Spain and all of Catholic Europe have imposed upon England, that no, we won't trade with you anymore unless you become Catholic again. All right. The son, Henry the Sixth, is the only male born to Henry VIII under one of his wives. He doesn't rule for long. You notice this, 1547 to 1553. It's only a few years. This is because Edward VI is kind of sickly and weak, and he dies very young. Mary, the first legitimate daughter of the Tudor line, meaning born of the first wife of Henry VIII, which was that Spanish princess, is going to become the queen now. And Mary doesn't rule for that long either. But while she's in charge, if you've ever heard of the tales of Bloody Mary, that's who this is. While she's in charge, she actually turns England back into a Catholic nation and then starts to hunt anybody in England who were in support that she can find, especially in the nobility, that were in support of Henry VIII's Church of England, his heretical against the Catholic Church, Church of England. And so Mary is called Bloody Mary because she is going to murder thousands of her own people while trying to basically get Spain and Catholic Europe to like England again so that they can trade. And that does happen. There is while people are dying in England, there is some trade happening because England is Catholic again for a little while. Mary dies. She actually gets ill with a terminal disease. She dies. And finally, the first daughter of the second wife of Henry VIII, that Anne Boleyn gal, is going to become the next queen of England. And in 1558, she's in charge and she rules for nearly 50 years. Okay, she rules for a long time, very stable, and she returns England back into a Anglican or Church of England, or I might say, non Catholic nation. And when she does this, Spain and all of Europe are suddenly at war with England again. And they are for her entire reign. So if Elizabeth I is going to rule for more than a few years, if her country, England, is going to actually be successful, if it's going to be able to import raw goods so that their people can manufacture things in England, tradespeople, and then sell those things somewhere. If Queen Elizabeth is going to have a successful nation, as opposed to a broke nation that is under attack from everybody in Catholic Europe, she's going to have to find a new way to make money that England has never really done before. And so we finally get to it, folks. Queen Elizabeth I is going to authorize the very first colony in England's history, very first official colony. And that colony is going to be set up by someone she has been kind of dating, if you will. Queen Elizabeth never marries anybody, but she does date a lot, okay? And so there's this guy here named Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh is going to be told by Queen Elizabeth that he needs to hire a ship and colonists to go set up a colony in England. And the reason for this is because England needs to find raw resources so that it can stay Protestant, meaning non Catholic, and so that England can do its own thing without fear of economic ruin because all of Catholic Europe is sanctioning England, is not trading with England. So England is forced to go and start colonies because it has to if it's going to survive. So Sir Walter Raleigh does. Okay, let me go down these slides here. Sir Walter Raleigh is going to set up a colony right here in this southern circle right here, right off the coast of modern day North Carolina on this little spit, the sandbar right here. And he's going to start a colony called Roanoke. Now, Roanoke, there's a whole story to what happens here. Sir Walter Raleigh's not the guy that came. All right, he actually hires a middle class merchantman named John White, and John White is going to go on this boat with 100 other people, including his wife and daughter, to set up this colony for the Queen of England and Sir Walter Raleigh. When this happens, the deal is that those 100 colonists are going to be dropped off here with John White in charge, the guy hired by Sir Walter Raleigh. And those 100 colonists are going to watch their ship leave with John White on it. He's going to go back and report in England as to where the colony is. This is all kind of secret information. You don't want the Spanish to find out that the English are here, anybody else. It's all like corporate secrets here. And so this English ship heads back, gets all the way back to England, and right when Sir Walter Raleigh meets with John White, his boss that's in charge of this colony, right when John White gets back to England, something happens. And what happens? This is actually some of the drawings that John White did of the natives that live nearby, farms and homes, organized streets and neighborhoods. Right, the whole thing. The natives were actually pretty advanced, and so the colony, in theory, is going to have to rely on these natives to probably survive. But the deal was that these 100 colonists were only supposed to survive for about 3 months before the next shipload of English people and their supplies showed up. And there was supposed to be shipload after shipload after shipload of English people and supplies coming here because there was a large unemployed population in England right at this point in the late 1500s because of the sanctions that Spain has had against England this whole time. And so you've got plenty of people who are so desperate that you can send over here to start this colony, and they weren't supposed to be just left here. These poor people in Roanoke, all right. And so what ends up happening is the Spanish Armada shows up. Well, that is a large conquistador navy that shows up to land 50,000 soldiers on England and conquer England. That's what these professional soldiers were supposed to do. This happens at the same exact time that John White has just gotten back with news of where he put this colony, that then more ships can go. And so he gets there. John White reports to Sir Walter Raleigh and the Queen and says, "Hey, we set up your colony of Roanoke. We're ready for more supplies. Let's load up the ship, and I will take it back." Okay, take it all back to the colony. And unfortunately, the Spanish have decided right then that they're going to invade England. So over the course of about 3 years, England goes into defense mode. England is going to fight back against the Spanish attack. Ultimately, the weather is going to destroy the Spanish navy that is trying to invade England. And of course, the Queen of England is going to say that's because God supported this new English church and supported her as queen and all that stuff. That's what you do if you're a leader. You want to say, God made this happen, God willed it, and therefore I am legitimate. And so, anyway, the Spanish Armada is going to try to invade England with 50,000 soldiers and professional forces here, and it's going to be destroyed by both weather and good English naval action. And finally, 3 years after Roanoke was settled, 3 years after these poor colonists were settled right here where I'm blinking my pointer, John White makes it back. He makes it back and he finds that there's nobody here. The colony is gone. And the people that were on this colony, some of them were his friends, two of them were his family. His wife and newborn daughter, newborn when he had left, were here. He left them here. And John White gets back and finds that there's nothing here. The colony, the buildings are there. Actually, I shouldn't be too like it's just gone. But the people are all gone. And there's no bones, there's no sign of burning, there's no sign of destruction like the natives attacked and the Spanish found the colony and destroyed it or anything like that. There's no evidence that there was any fighting. The colonists are just gone. And so, what scholars, for the most part, think right now is that aliens. No, I'm just kidding. We're not watching the History Channel. The scholars right now, the biggest real opinion is that these colonists actually left. Without the English ever coming back. They figured that nobody was coming to support them, that they were forgotten. This wouldn't be the first time this has ever happened in colonial history. And so the English colonists, we think, went down here a little further, where there was a tribe of natives friendly to the English at the time called the Croatan. And we think that they went to go live with the Croatan, but there's no proof of that in any real way. There's just coincidences and supposition and that sort of thing. We don't know for sure. So the deal is, folks, is that it's quite a mystery as to what happened in Roanoke, and the reason why Roanoke disappears or the people leave, we think, is because the English had to forget about them for 3 years while they were fighting the Spanish, and the English were fighting the Spanish because the Spanish had finally had enough of the English trying to be all Protestant and non-Catholic, and that's over now. Once in 1588, the Spanish Armada is defeated. And the very first English colony that was set up specifically to get around Spanish sanctions is set up, but of course it disappears. So what that means is now the English need to try again. And so a few years later, a new colony is going to be built under the next guy in charge of England, King James. A new colony is going to be founded right here in Virginia. And that colony is going to be called Jamestown, named after King James. So we don't have to worry about these guys. This is the destruction of the Spanish Armada, all that stuff, right? So in 1607, because the English are desperate to find a way to make money without European trade, they need to set up a colony that they can trade with instead. Okay, just to reiterate that. And so you have Jamestown. Now, Jamestown did not originally need a fortress palisade. It's just what happens is the natives that lived in this region, called the Powhatan, are not all that friendly, meaning they're not putting up with the English doing anything that they don't want them to do. And sometimes the English did some dumb things, like they would attack the Powhatan and steal their food and that sort of thing. So this colony is going to have a wall built around it. It starts in 1607, and it's not going to do well, at least not at first, because what happens is that very first winter of 1607, there is a horrible, horrible winter in the winter of 1607 going into the fall or the spring of 1608. And this winter is going to kill about 70% of the people that lived here. What that meant was that there were a couple hundred colonists living here, and most of them will die. All but 40 of them will die. And the reason for that is because of that horrible winter. That winter was so bad that archaeologists who are still digging up the graves of Jamestown, you can go to Facebook and find the Jamestown Archaeological Expedition and actually follow along. But they are digging up the early graves of Jamestown, and they're finding that some of the bones have human teeth marks on them, like they were gnawed upon. And we have some actual court trial evidence from years later that prove that there were some men here in Jamestown during the horrible winter of 1607 and 1608 who actually killed their own wives and ate them. Like that actually happened. That's how bad this was. This was a horrible time, okay? And so Jamestown, the second attempt at an English colony, almost fails too. But luckily, there was no Spanish invasion happening at the time, and James is just starting his reign, King James the First, and so he sends more people, more colonists, more colonists, more colonists. And those colonists are going to be able to keep this colony going while they figure out what they're going to do to make money. How are these guys going to help England in this weird part of Virginia? How are they going to become a profitable venture? And finally, what happens is Europe, right around 1610, so a few years later, Europe has really caught a hold of a substance that some English, some Dutch, and some Spanish and Portuguese explorers have brought back to Europe. And what that is something called tobacco. Wealthy Europeans all throughout Western Europe have begun to become addicted to tobacco. And it's not that easy to get. You know, you can buy it from the Portuguese at a fortune, huge price. The Spanish, huge price. But if you want to buy really good quality tobacco, it's hard to find it. And as it turns out, in Jamestown, Virginia, tobacco grows like a weed. The farmers here were actually cutting it down to make way. We're destroying natural tobacco plants to make way for food production because they wanted to eat. And so Jamestown, the guys that are operating it, there's this company in England called the Jamestown Company, the Virginia Company. I apologize. The Virginia Company is in charge of Jamestown, and that company in 1610 is going to say, hey, don't worry about food, guys. Just start growing and sending us tobacco because Europe wants it, and that's going to be the way that we make money. And so, ladies and gentlemen, in 1614, that's your next date. In 1614, 7 years after this colony starts, in 1614, a giant shipment, a number of ships full of dried processed tobacco, is going to leave Jamestown and make its way back to England. And the Virginia Company that is in charge of Jamestown is going to make a fortune on selling that tobacco in England. Now, what's going to happen is there's so much tobacco that grows here in Virginia that this colony is going to become an instant success starting around 1614. And that instant success means two things. More people are going to move to Jamestown so that they can also grow tobacco and get wealthy. And on top of that, it also means that the rest of Europe is going to notice that England, a country that they're supposed to ignore because of Spanish sanctions against England. I'm going to go back to the big map again. England which is still under Queen Elizabeth and then the beginning of James's rule. England, which is not supposed to be touched, not traded with by anybody in Catholic Europe, England is suddenly going to find that many nations, including France, are going to allow it to trade with them secretly at first because they wanted the tobacco so badly. And so tobacco coming from way over here in Virginia is going to be making its way over to England, and that tobacco is going to allow England to trade against Spanish sanctions with a lot of Europe. And it's also going to make a lot of money because there's people that are over here growing tobacco and people over here that are buying tobacco. And so there's this trade happening that is based on tobacco that's going to make people on both sides wealthy. Okay, so we'll talk more about this in a second. Let me just get back to here. I want to tell you about this. There's this thing that I would call a memorial year, not a celebratory year, a memorial year. By the time we get to 1619, 1620, there's a big problem in that there's lots of people that own land that have moved to Virginia, but there's not a lot of people that actually want to work the land. Stoop labor is hard labor. That's the planting and harvesting of tobacco. That's a lot of hard work. And the people that were moving from England to take over plots of territory in Jamestown don't want any part of having to do all the work themselves. And so the first group of people that they could bring in are indentured servants, poorer English people without jobs who need a job, who can work for about 7 to 10 years for a landowner in Jamestown. All right, that's an indentured servant. However, as the economy gets better in England, by the time we get to about 1620, there are fewer indentured servants. And what that means is Jamestown is going to need to start hiring other people. What other people can they find to hire? Well, as it turns out, they don't need to hire anybody at all because in 1619, a Dutch slave ship is going to stop by Jamestown to buy food and water. And to get that resupply of food and water, that Dutch slave ship is going to pay for it in 20 slaves. And so, for the first time in Jamestown in 1619, you have slaves. And those slaves, their story is kind of interesting because some of them are going to be indentured and then they're going to be free and they're going to actually own slaves themselves one day. And others are going to be immediately enslaved. It just depends on what happens to them and who it ended up taking them in. But the end result is that there was no intention by England to have slavery at all anywhere. And then in 1619, the money was so good and the labor was so hard to find for growing tobacco that the idea of starting purchasing slaves became, well, it was opened up to the English when that Dutch slave ship stopped off and dropped off 20 slaves. And so the English are simply going to start buying slaves from Dutch slave ships, and then the English will start going on their own to Africa to buy slaves. So that's the beginning of the slave trade in the English colonies, which is Virginia, Jamestown, right? The colony of Virginia that is so successful growing tobacco that it needs labor. And the best, cheapest labor that they could find in 1619, apparently, are African slaves. So that's how that begins. Okay. I'm not going to talk too much about Nathaniel Bacon because I'm going to give you an assignment on that. But what I will do is just show you that here's Jamestown. And then by the time we get to 1680, remember this was founded in 1607. By 1680, you've got all these people that live all over the place here. All right, you've got a large series of towns that have built up all over the region within 50 miles, pushing the natives back while also setting up their own territory. And this is the beginning of the first truly successful colonial system in America that the English set up. Now, keep in mind, this is on the Chesapeake Bay of Virginia, and therefore this is called, or these are called the Chesapeake colonies. These are not religious colonies, meaning they're not Puritans, they're not Quakers, they're Anglicans who are here for money and for profit off of tobacco mostly, but they're not here to set up some kind of Puritan town. That's not yet, okay? That's a different set of colonies and a different lecture that's coming next. So the Chesapeake Bay or the Virginia Chesapeake colonies is a pure money-making venture where England has set up colonies so that it has somebody to trade with, and England's going to make a ton of money off of the tobacco that comes from Jamestown and other similar colonies that are going to be built for this purpose. So, to reiterate what I was saying about the different colonies, here's Jamestown, is going to be right here next to Williamsburg, Virginia, the very first English colony that is successful in America, the James River. So, these are the Chesapeake colonies, and this thing here is the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, so the southern Chesapeake colonies base largely all of these here in tobacco production. Okay, and then up here, so that's 1607 when those start. Then up here in 1620, you've got those Puritans that you often hear about. Those Puritans who are going to come up this way, and they're going to set up a series of colonies right here. And these are going to be for profit too. It's also for religious dissidents, meaning the Puritans who found New England way up here, a few hundred miles north. Okay, the Puritans that set up New England up here, a different territory, they do this because they want to have the freedom to make money the way they want to make it by collecting raw resources to sell to English merchants, but also they want to be able to practice their religion. So these are two different colonies: the Chesapeake colonies, just money and tobacco, and the New England colonies, which are religious colonies. Gives you a better idea. The settlement of New England, 1620. So we've now talked about, okay, why the English started colonies in the first place. They were desperate for two things. One, to have their own church, the Church of England, thanks to Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, and also they wanted to be able to survive, and they couldn't survive as long as Spanish sanctions were in place. And so the only way for England to survive was to finally set up colonies, and that's why they do it. And so those colonies become successful, not with Roanoke, which was a big mystery, but it's going to be successful with Jamestown eventually, right here in 1607. And that is so successful that all these colonies are going to build up north and south of Jamestown, and even religious reformers will leave England and start their own colonies, and they're going to make money there too. So we're going to start a lecture. Our next lecture is going to be about the Puritans. Might as well break all this up, okay? And that will start in, when you start the next lecture. Thanks a lot.